Hello there guys, what is going on? Son of Chelsea back here again for another episode of Added Time, answering your questions that you kindly submitted for today's video. So let's get straight into it. Firstly here with Roy, who asked, from the teams who were relegated yesterday, which players could be valuable signings for our squad? For me, Saul would be great. He's a good player for Watford, of course. And from Watford, I personally think, and I know some people will turn their nose up at this, but Matt Law made this point yesterday, and I've made it on the channel before. I think for Chelsea looking for a goalkeeper, and I think this option is good if Chelsea can't get the first choice targets this summer. Ben Foster. I think Ben Foster would be a good signing for Chelsea. Yes, he is not a world-class goalkeeper. He is not the sort of goalkeeper of a Jan Oblak level that Chelsea fans may crave this summer, or even an Andre Onana potentially. But Ben Foster, for me, has been super impressive this season for Watford. He really has. I don't think he deserves to be in the Championship next season. I think out of all the Watford players this season, I think Ben Foster can be proud of this season. I think personally, just based on what I've seen from him this year, he's always put in good performances, made some exceptional saves for them. I remember the game against Watford for Chelsea where he put on an amazing display. I mean, Chelsea could have scored about 5 goals that day, but he made some incredible stops. And he's a sort of keeper, Premier League experience. I think great character for the dressing room. I think it would be good to bring into a team like Chelsea. I know he signed a contract extension recently with Watford, so that may change that sort of thinking, but he's gone down to the Championship now, and potentially there's some release clause in there for Chelsea that could capitalise on it. And I just think, based on what Chelsea are lacking from a goalkeeper, yes, Ben Foster, of course, is not the long-term option in goal for Chelsea. But I just wonder, in the current situation, if Chelsea can't get their first choice target, I think even for a backup goalkeeper, Ben Foster would be brilliant. So that's my opinion on that. Brendan asks, do you see Azpilicueta getting less game time next season to accommodate Recce James, although Azpi shows no signs of slowing down? Once again, a brilliant performance from Azpilicueta yesterday. He has been one of the players of the season. I think in maybe a top 5, I think Dave, you'd have to maybe put his name in there for consistency over this season. I think Frank Lampard has leaned heavily on his experience and leadership this year. I think it's going to be a really interesting time next year. I don't think it's as clear as I think a lot of us predicted earlier in the year. I think a lot of us thought that by the end of this season, Dave would maybe be phased out of the team, especially after he had a real struggle at the start of the season. But he has shown he is not going to let his position go easily. And all that experience, all that winning mentality, all that nous that he has, he's used it so much this season. And I think Recce James, especially in the current system, if Frank persists with this 3-4-3, I think it helps out Recce James at the moment, because he's got that defensive solidity and experience behind him of Dave, which I think helps, and I think helps James be more expressive and a bit more free to roam up the pitch and help Chelsea in attack, which is where I think Recce James is really a threat at the moment. I think for Recce James, because I think long-term Frank, I think, may want to move to a back 4 again, a 4-3-3, which of course is then when, you know, you can only pick one of those players, and especially if we get a new left back as well, you know, I don't really want to see Dave shifting over to left back again long term, because at the moment it's a quick fix for Lampard. He sort of got round at times. But yeah, I could see Dave definitely still getting minutes next year. I think that's going to be a really interesting test, one that Recce James has to improve. I think defensively he has to get better. I think, you know, learning from Dave. I mean, Dave's defensive quality has always been there, and also consistency of performance. I think for someone like Recce James, yes, he's a modern day fullback, but I think he could learn so much from Dave. So I think it's still going to be an interesting tussle next year, and I wouldn't put it past Dave getting some more minutes next season under Frank Lampard, because he's done it this year. CFC Bahu asked, do you rate Zakaria from Gladbach, and do you think he could be an alternative for Declan Rice? I think he could be. I think that central defensive midfield role, especially if Frank wants to play this 4-3-3, I personally think that just what we saw at the start of Project Restart, where Frank decided to go, I'm going to put N'Golo Kante as the holding player and 2 sort of bombing midfielders in front of him. Frank wants to play a very proactive style of football, and I think that was a glimpse into what I think Frank wants long-term Chelsea to look like. I think the 3-4-3 is a good system. It works at the moment because it, you know, maybe helps, as you've seen in the Man United and Wolves games, helps cover up some of the inefficiencies in Chelsea's game currently. But I don't think that's going to be the formation long term, especially with this type of players Frank is bringing in, especially attacking wise. Zakaria could be that, because my biggest concern is Kante's fitness long term. We've seen it this year. He's had a major struggle. I mean, he may not even play the FA Cup final. And the concern is, even if he does, you know, think about last year. He played that Europa League final, and he was brilliant in that game for Chelsea against Arsenal, but it really set him back, I think, further, because he was a major doubt for that final, if you remember. So it's a big thing, and especially with the congested nature now of football because of the coronavirus and because of how much football is going to be played. You know, there's barely a gap between the end of this season for Chelsea and the start of the next season, the amount of games, and then going into Euro 2020, and then you start next season and there's a FIFA World Cup. I mean, it is going to be absolutely ridiculous, and Chelsea need to find, and I think Frank needs someone who can fill in for that role. If he wants to stick with a 4-3-3, I think Chelsea should be looking at a wide variety of options because it has been a key issue this year. Byron G asks, who is likely to get more minutes next season, Ruben Loftus-Cheek or Callum Hudson-ODOI? I think both are going to have struggles next year. I think for similar reasons. I mean, look at both players' positions. I mean, Kai Havertz coming into central midfield, a place that Ruben would like to play as well. Hakim Ziyech coming in Callum Hudson-ODOI's place as well. That's another thing for me that's going to be a massive struggle for a lot of the young players in the squad is, can they raise their level to continue to be in the first team? That's the thing under Frank. You know, he wants to give young players opportunity, and especially for Ruben more than I think Callum. You know, Ruben is in the prime of his career now. He's not a youngster anymore, and Ruben said this. You know, he's in the prime of his career now. He needs to, you know, really progress now and really get into that first team, which I think he can. I'm a massive fan of Ruben Loftus-Cheek. I've continued to say that on his channel, how much I rate him, how much I think a fit Ruben Loftus-Cheek would be massive for Chelsea. But it's going to be congested. It's going to be difficult. I mean, squad depth-wise, it really helps Chelsea out with that 5-sub rule potentially still being in the Premier League next season. It's going to favour a team like Chelsea to give minutes to players consistently over the season. But at the same time, I mean, maybe I'll go Ruben because I just think Ruben's ready to make that next step. I think Callum potentially as well could get those minutes, but I'd probably say Ruben Loftus-Cheek. But both have a massive struggle in their hands because it's going to be so competitive under Frank Lampard next season with the new signings coming in. Manhandled CFC asks, do you think Chelsea have overachieved this season? I think they have. I think they absolutely have. Now, I know some people, you know, especially if you're outside of Chelsea, will look at Chelsea and think, you know, this is sort of the bare minimum for Chelsea. And I think, you know, I've seen this sort of, as the season's gone on, I think there's been sort of a changing of the goalpost by some people regarding Chelsea, maybe because we've done better during the season, especially in earlier periods that people expected us to. And we've been in that top 4 slot for so long, basically since October, we haven't dropped out the top 4. So really impressive on that. So maybe people have adjusted their expectations, but I think you have to go back to pre-season. What were people thinking about Chelsea under Frank Lampard this season in pre-season before a ball being kicked? I think that's a fair judgment. I think it really is. I think changing expectations halfway through the season, I think context-wise matters for this Chelsea team. Have they overachieved? When you compare this Chelsea team to even last season, having Eden Hazard, seasons before that, some of the best Chelsea teams, they're going to pale in comparison. I think when you're talking about this season, you have to look at the transfer ban, look at the experience of the first team head coach, looking at where Frank Lampard picked up Chelsea as a club, the feeling of the club 12 months ago when he arrived, the doubts over him from Chelsea fans, the fears that I had as a Chelsea fan with Frank Lampard coming in at that moment in time, at the problems with, you know, fans being divided, you know, the feeling of direction at Chelsea. Where were we really going now? Another reset under a new manager. How could Frank cope with no players to bring in, and the young players he was bringing into the team? Could they cope under the spotlight and the harsh criticism that comes with being a Chelsea player? And overall, when you factor all those things in, especially considering the 4-0 defeat to Man United on the first day of the season, if you'd have told Chelsea fan then that Chelsea would still get top 4 ahead of Tottenham, ahead of Arsenal, ahead of a lot of clubs, and some of the big wins Frank Lampard has achieved this season, I think you have to be impressed. So yeah, I do think it's an overachievement for Frank Lampard, and I think he absolutely deserves all the praise for it because I think he's done quite an incredible job in the circumstances, to be honest. Bagavath asked, player of the season. Very tough question. I'm probably going to make a video on this again. I made one during lockdown, but of course, because of Project Restart, there's been some performances within there, some key players that have done incredible things since then. So I think it's difficult. I think there are some players, of course, and I think if you're just judging it, which is very easy as a fan, when you're just judging on results recently and the way you feel about players currently, of course, Christian Pulisic and Olivier Giroud are going to come to the front of your mind because they've been essential for Chelsea in getting over the line for Champions League football. Consistently over the season, I think 2 players stand out for me, Mateo Kovacic and Mason Mount. I think if you're just looking at performance level, and I think just behind them, you've got Dave and you've got Willian. I think the problem for Pulisic is he had those injury problems, but when you look at the actual minutes he's played when he has been fit, he's been incredible. So maybe you could factor him in there. Tammy was brilliant for the first part of the season with goals, and then Olivier Giroud was brilliant for the second period of the season with goals. Of course, you could throw the caveat with Giroud saying, you know, he didn't play the full season as the main striker, didn't really get minutes until after Christmas. But still, I think if we're being fair, I think Kovacic has been consistently brilliant for Chelsea. His performance level has usually been 7, 8 out of 10, which is where you want a player of player of the season to be at. And Mason Mount has been so essential for Frank Lampard's system, the versatility, being a young player. I think probably a win-win situation for me is Kovacic gets player of the season and Mason Mount gets young player of the year. I think that may be the way it falls out, but I know a lot of people will be of a difference of opinion, which is fine. I think there's a lot of options there, but those are my personal opinions on it. Liam George asked, not a question, but you need to mention how Pedro has been such a great player for us, always fighting no matter the score. Great point, Liam. I did not mention Pedro, unfortunately, in my rational perspective yesterday, and it was his final game at Stamford Bridge. Of course, he's going to move on to Roma now for next season. Could feature a little bit maybe in the FA Cup final. It'd be lovely for him to get another medal for Chelsea. What a glittering CV for an amazing player. I've loved watching Pedro in a Chelsea shirt. I reposted an article I wrote during lockdown for All Things Chelsea. I'll leave the link in the description box for that. Please go and read it, because it was all about Pedro's Chelsea career and honouring it, because I think he's had a brilliant time at Chelsea, he really has, and I think we will miss him. I think influence in the dressing room, I think some of the younger players will look up to him, his CV, what he's done in the game. There was an article in The Athletic just basically titled, you know, Pedro has won at football, and he really has. And I think the class he brought very early on at Chelsea in that 15-16 season, which was terrible, but he was a shining light within that dark period for Chelsea, and he was amazing under Conte. I mean, he really was. That was probably his best season for Chelsea. He became, I think he was ahead of Willian in terms of minutes that year, and he scored some big goals for Conte in that title-winning year. And the big goals he scored at key moments, you look at the goals Pedro has scored for Chelsea, they're always big goals within games. They're like openers to a game, or a clincher in a game, or a winner. Very rarely are his goals like the 4th or 5th in a game, you know, where the game's tied up basically. He usually scores important goals. That Europa League final goal against Arsenal as well. So I really hope fans give him the appreciation, which most do. I think most have a real appreciation for Pedro. That smile, sort of the skill, the flair of watching Pedro. His first touch taking a ball out of the air, one of the most impressive things in his game. And I'm going to miss him. I think he's been brilliant for Chelsea. So thanks for pointing that out, because I wanted to give him appreciation on the channel. And lastly, Toff It Off asks, is Chilwell still a realistic option for left back at this point? Maybe. I think as time has gone on, as Chelsea now going in for Kai Havertz, that's something, you know, I talked a lot about Chilwell during lockdown, and I think, of course, one thing we didn't know was how serious Chelsea were going to be about Kai Havertz. I didn't think Chelsea were going to go in for a midfielder this summer, but clearly they have now in Kai Havertz, and I think that has changed the game, which I think means that Tagliafico, I think, may be the most realistic option at this point. I think it's becoming a bit of a no-brainer, and I just think based on centre-back and goalkeeper as well, which Chelsea are going to want to invest in this summer, I just think left back, maybe Tagliafico may be the only option with Leicester, even though they didn't get Champions League football. You know, look at the price they got out of Man United without Champions League football for Harry Maguire, and it's quite clear Leicester aren't going to budge on that price for Ben Chilwell. And I just think, you know, he's been injured now. He's had a poor end to the season. Yes, in the age range, I think he's good for Chelsea, and the profile player Frank Lampard is bringing in a young player who can improve. Just based on that price, I think Chelsea may look elsewhere now, look to centre back, and think we'll prioritise spending money in that area. Goalkeeper as well. Tagliafico looks like quite an obvious option at this point, an experienced player who can add what we need, even if it is for a short period that maybe Chilwell can give you. I think Tagliafico, so I think Chilwell may be off the table now, in my opinion. So that is it for this episode of Added Time. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch it. If you did enjoy it, hit that subscribe button and a notification bell so you never miss an upload. Follow me on Twitter @SonOfChelsea. Have a great day, and I'll see you again.